Matthew 19. Of course, Matthew 19, probably most, not all of us know that it deals with marriage and divorce. Not the only thing it deals with. But one of the introductory question kind of goes along the lines of marriage and divorce. And obviously, it's something that's well, I guess it's mainly more divorce than marriage that's really prevalent in our society today. And so I thought it might be good to just kind of introduce the idea of marriage and then talk about maybe a little bit why some marriages end like they do. And so the first part of question number one is, what do you think are the ingredients for a happy marriage? What are some things that everybody needs to have a happy marriage?
Learning how to say you're right.
Okay, I was trying to think of humility. How about that? Does that work for you?
Sure.
Humility, you good at that? Yeah, humility. You have to not always going to be in the right, are you? So you have to be able to admit when you're not. What else? That's pretty important, isn't it? And not just physical attraction. Now, physical attraction should be part of the marriage relationship, but it's more like agape love, isn't it? Like we think about in the Bible, which is you want what's best for the other person, regardless of what they said or they've done or the situation that you might find yourselves in. And if you don't have that kind of love for your husband or your wife, then your marriage is not going to last very long. Go ahead, Daryl.
I think being unselfish, thinking about the other person instead of yourself.
Yeah. I had selflessness. That's one of the things I think that are very important in a marriage relationship. If you're going to have a happy marriage and you're going to have a lasting marriage, you have to put your spouse first. Yes, sir.
Grace, giving grace to your spouse, giving the benefit of the doubt.
Okay.
During a conversation, they say something, and your initial reaction is, you think it sounded bad, you think it meant it. Stop and go. Explain that conversation, explain that statement, so I make sure I understand what you meant, and give it the benefit of the doubt that they didn't mean to say or insinuate.
Okay.
It goes to communication, but it goes a little further than that, because I'm going to trust you didn't mean to upset me. Now tell me what you mean.
I'm sorry, I just saw Gary start chuckling. So that would probably fall in a couple of different categories. I think patience is definitely needed in a marriage relationship. If you're not a patient person, you're not going to have a happy marriage or a lasting one. Also, I guess the second part of that would be forgiveness, wouldn't it? Like you said, not always thinking the worst about everybody, and we're not always our best, in the marriage relationship, and so we have to have a forgiving spouse, don't we? Or that's not going to work, and we have to be forgiving ourselves. Go ahead, Miss Judy.
Well, the first thing that helps it is if you're both Christians.
Okay.
Most of us start ours out not that way, and you have a lot of problems that you wouldn't have had.
Yeah, and it's no guarantee if two Christians marry that, you're going to have a happy marriage and a lasting marriage, but I would say the odds are, and if they're truly following Christ, it's going to be a good marriage. But yeah, one of the difficulties that are often encountered in marriage, and this is actually, I wrote that on the flip part of this because I think the second part of it was, what factors tend to kind of chip away at marriage and end up leaving a couple more susceptible to divorce. But religious differences, are one of the contributing factors to divorce today. One of the major contributing factors. So, Adam, did you have one?
I was echoing Miss Judy there, and I was thinking it's not required, but if you have the same mission or goal in life, I think that is helpful because you're making decisions based on the same end goal.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I want to emphasize it's not impossible because we read about it in the Bible. There were people who married, lasted the marriage, had great kids, godly kids out of it, but the Bible also talks about the wisdom of such choices too. So Any others that come to mind?
Age. Age,
Age?
yes.
Explain that for me.
Okay, I'll be happy to. It's like, statistically, the majority of the divorces occur the first year of marriage. And a lot of that is because immaturity on the part, or on each person's part, because they've been used to living most usually separate and then suddenly thrown together. And the ideas are different about a lot of things. And there's a lot of pressures on people that's just newly married. That maybe, that once you get more mature in your marriage and your relationship and get stronger, then, that makes a difference.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point too. I don't think, it's like any other major event in your life. It takes adjustment, doesn't it? You don't always know you think you know when you go into something how it's going to be, but you don't always. And sometimes it takes a big adjustment on our part. Any others? Go ahead.
Going on what you said, when we got married, I didn't realize how much work it was gonna be, you do your dating and, boy, everything was just great, you ever see her with bad hair, or she don't see you in a bad mood, but the new reality hits, it's something where it's a lot of work, and, you gotta put your own feelings aside, and it's work.
Yeah, and that's I always said that's an important factor. We need to emphasize that to our young people too, because when you're dating, you're trying to impress each other, aren't you? You're on your best behavior, and so if the best behavior is bad, it's only going to get worse whenever you get married. So there's certainly some red flags and danger signs to watch for in some of those areas. Got another one?
Somewhere in the same vein as what he said, you have to keep dating your spouse.
Yes.
If you don't keep dating your spouse, then they don't see, to some degree, they don't see the parts of you that's the reason they ended up your spouse.
Yeah. And I think that, to me, that falls more under the heading of time spent together. And I think one of the things that are detrimental to so many marriages today is we're just so busy doing stuff. If you got kids, sometimes we've got our kids wrapped up in so many things. The husband's going this way, the wife's going this way. You're working all the time. Just don't hardly see each other or spend any time with each other. Any good relationship, you're going to have to invest some time into that relationship. And like you said, it's not just getting married, but it's sustaining that relationship and keep spending that time together, doing things together. I think that's really important, a happy marriage. Any others? Okay, so the flip side of the coin, I mentioned it just briefly. What do you think are some of the factors that kind of chip away at marriages today and leave people more susceptible to divorce? We could just say the opposite of everything we said, right? But kind of clarify it or spell it out for us.
If you look at the professional world, professional entertainers, singers, actors, professional sports, politicians, CEOs of companies, the all common factor is that a high percentage of divorce. Very extremely high. Few make it. And I think the reason is too much focus and energy put into their profession rather than their family. And they're gone all the time. Those two factors is pretty much ingredient to divorce.
Yeah, I think you're right. And there's a lot of, I think, different labels you could probably put on that, but like you said, I think really it just amounts to selfishness, don't you? You're so infatuated with your job that you just pour all your time and your energy into it. You don't leave any time and energy for your family, or I don't know, maybe you don't like your family, so you don't come home. You go out and do other things. But selfishness, I think, in our world today is probably the major contributor to divorce, and that could cover a lot of different areas. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Social media, especially for media was normal. You were on 5 different platforms or something. Well, social media makes the world a really small place. So somebody who, not defending or saying they do or don't, but someone who might be easily tempted, the world's a really small place and it's really easy to behave bad.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know what the best label, I've got a couple of things here. Infidelity would be one of those that you could label it. I think I wrote down addiction here, and I was thinking, you know, there's so many different kinds of addictions that lead to divorce and tear apart marriages. And you can have alcohol and you can have drugs, but I think one of the major ones in our society today is pornography. I mean, it's a major contributor to the break in the marriage relationship and how men and women view one another. And it is an addiction. I mean, there are many people who are addicted to that today. Not good for a marriage relationship. Any others come to mind?
Money's on top of most people's lists.
Money, finances, yeah, unfortunately, that leads to a lot of divorces today, right? Just the product of the nation that we live in. I wrote down a lack of equality. You know, sometimes one spouse views themselves as more important than the other in a marriage, instead of viewing it as a 50-50 relationship, and that's not going to end up well if that's the case. Poor communication, abuse. Any others come to mind?
Health is probably the selfishness.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate too, because I was looking at some of the statistics. I didn't even write it down, but weight gain was one of the major contributors to divorce today. So if your spouse gets fat, just put them away and marry somebody else. I guess that's the mindset of the world. But it is, isn't it? I mean, like you said, and if somebody loses, you know, has a major illness or a major disease, I mean, it's common in our day and world just to say you cast them aside and pick up somebody else. So, yeah, there's a number of things, and you know, we say all those things and think about them. What do you think it was like in Jesus' day? You ever study any, or you ever look at any historical background, or even just think about some of the things that Jesus said and how people reacted to it? How do you think marriage and divorce was in his day?
Divorce is very common.
It was, wasn't it? I mean, I don't view it much different than the world in which we live today. And it wasn't, you know, it wasn't just divorce itself. One of the things that really gets me about the Jewish nation, and I know I'm kind of throwing them in one general lump or summation here, but and not even just the Jews, but kind of the general mindset of the world is how little value they placed on women, and consequently how little value they placed on the marriage relationship. And I mean, you read through the Bible and you read about women, they weren't treated very well, were they? But that was just kind of the day and age and the product of society in which people lived. And so I think in Jesus' day it wasn't any different. You know, they didn't have a very high view of a woman, and thus they didn't have a very high view of the marriage relationship. So if you married a woman, you didn't like her, divorce her. Go marry somebody else. And you can do that over and over and over again. And so Matthew 19, that's what Jesus deals with here in the first part of this chapter. And it begins with a question from the Pharisees. And what was that question, or I guess question number 2 here on your handout? Really, it was a trick question, wasn't it? But what was the question that they came and asked Jesus?
Is it lawful to put away his wife for every cause?
Yeah, and what do you think they meant by that question? I say that because in Mark's account, in Mark chapter 10 and verse 2, it says the Pharisees came and asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife, testing him? And so it seems like to me the question was, is it even lawful to divorce your wife? You know, what do you say about this? What's your stance in this particular instance? And why would that be a tempting question for Christ? same reason it's a tempting question today, right? Yeah, when people aren't in a right relationship when it comes to marriage, you know, it's not a popular subject. And so if you think about the goal of the Pharisees, right now they're trying to destroy Christ, aren't they? In any way that they possibly can. And so one of the ways that they could have done it very quickly was get the crowd to turn on them. And they thought, well, what better way to do that than to ask a question like this, probably knowing that there were many people within these audiences who were in that state who had divorced. And so they asked him that question, is it lawful to divorce your wife, for a man to divorce his wife? And of course they weren't honest and sincere in that, but just trying to tempt him. And so how does Jesus respond to that trick question? Yeah, where does he go?
The beginning.
He goes all the way back to the beginning. And we might put it in this way. He goes back to the original. You know, if you ever have any questions about anything, where's the best place to go?
It starts.
To the start, right? Back to the original. Go all the way back to the very first. And then you can look at it, and then you can answer questions in accordance with that. So that's what Jesus does. He goes all the way back to the original marriage, to Adam and Eve. And he kind of lays out this scenario in the marriage relationship from God's view, and kind of God's thoughts and God's intentions behind marriage itself, right? That's really what Jesus is driving at here. And then answering their question, you know, where does divorce enter into that picture? And so when you go back to Adam and Eve, what picture do you get out of marriage from that relationship? What are some important things? There could be a number of things. But this is the original. This is what God began with, and this is the beginning of it, the start of it. So, what do you get from it?
2 or 1.
Okay? Not 3 or 1, or 4 or 1, right? There's a lot of discussion even in the Church of Christ today about, you know, men in the Bible who had multiple wives. And one of the arguments that I've heard is, well, you know, people had to repopulate. Well, I think the first man and woman would be pretty important repopulating, wouldn't you? I think if a man needed more than one wife, God would have gave Adam more than one to begin with. But how many did he give him? He gave him one. And so you had one man and you had one woman. And how long did they stay together? Their lifetime, right? So you have this picture of how God intended it and how He designed it, and how Adam and Eve carried it out in that first marriage relationship. So, you know, it's important, again, if you have questions about something, the best place to go is back to the original. Look at the original. It'll answer all your questions. And so Jesus, in essence, draws them back to their own scriptures. And He says, well, what happened in the beginning here? You know, what did that marriage relationship look like? And so what kind of ideas and concepts do you get about divorce from the first marriage relationship?
Wasn't part of the plan.
Yeah. Wasn't in the plan, was it? Wasn't that God came up with this design and this relationship and then said, well, here's a way out. You know, it was God's intention for that man and that woman to stay together for a lifetime. And so Jesus kind of, you know, draws this picture of this first marriage relationship, taking them all the way back to the start and said, if you want to know how it's supposed to be, then look at this original. You know, look at this beginning. And so question number 3 here, we kind of talked about it, but what did Jesus say is God's ideal for marriage? He didn't even just imply it or infer it. What did He say? Verse 6. Yeah, no separation, right? No divorce. So you have this idea and this plan of God, this pattern, this example of the marriage relationship in Adam and Eve. And so where was God's plan for divorce in the beginning? Wasn't there? Wasn't. So you think about, you think about all these things. Where does the problem enter into this relationship?
Man's desire.
Yeah, it's man's hard heart. It's man's stubbornness, his rejection of God's plan. And even in the case, and that's the second part of question number 3 here, what's the ideal situation, even in marriage, that's been affected by adultery? Yeah, it's that your spouse acknowledges they're wrong, asks you for forgiveness, and you forgive them. And that relationship is reconciled, right? That you think about God and you think about His character, but I think God's way, even in marriages that are not perfect, God's way is forgiveness, it's reconciliation, it's mending fences, isn't it? And that's really every relationship, if you think about it, isn't it? There's no relationship where God says, hey, if it doesn't work out, you just cut ties and part ways and don't talk to each other, be friendly to each other anymore. But that would be the ideal situations, even in imperfect marriages. So, yes, we're human. Yes, we create problems. Yes, we sin. That always is going to affect the marriage relationship. But again, if you look at the beginning of it, God's intentions were for that one man and that woman to stay together for life. And so Jesus just kind of points out there, what God joined together, who God joined together, don't let man put asunder. That was God's plan for divorce in the beginning. So what follow-up question number 4 here does Jesus' enemies ask?
What about the law of Moses?
Yeah, so why did Moses write Deuteronomy 24, right? That's basically what they're asking here. And, if we're not going to have, I don't think, well, let's turn over there real quickly. We may just do the first part of this sheet. We don't study this subject too much in detail. But in Deuteronomy chapter 24, of course, Moses, this is what he wrote in the law, beginning in verse 1. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of her house, or out of his house. When she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So you read about Moses where he wrote about giving the wife a writing of divorcement and putting her away. And so their question is this: listen, if this was God's plan from the beginning, no divorce, no separation, why did Moses write about a divorce here? Why did he say you write a certificate of divorce and you give it to her and you put her away? And so what's Jesus' response to that question? Second part of question number 4 on your handout here.
He told them that it was because of the hardness of their hearts that happened that way.
Yeah. So, this is kind of interesting to me, and every time I study something, I always get something else out of it. But he basically says this. He says, Moses, you guys were so hard-hearted that Moses wrote this for you. But what did he say about the beginning?
It was not so.
That wasn't how it was in the beginning. Okay, so what does that mean? How are we supposed to take that, do you think?
Christ is taking it back to the beginning.
Yeah, and basically, there's a lot. I wish we had more details about this writing and everything that it entailed. But if God didn't allow divorce, and again, think about society in that day. Think about their view of women. Think about how they treated women. Think about the rights of a woman. So her husband decides he's going to divorce her and put her away. What kind of situation is she in?
She's homeless and destitute.
I mean, you're basically left for dead, aren't you? Because a woman has very little rights, very few rights in that day and age when it comes to owning property, owning land, making a living, things like that. You've been divorced. Is anybody going to remarry you? Probably not. So you're kind of out here where you're stuck by yourself. You're between a rock and a hard place. And so I think what happened is Moses kind of helped women out. I even read, and again, I wish we knew the entire background of this, but I even read some commentators that were talking about, the people knew the severity of this law, and so they just kill their wife. Just kill her and marry somebody else. So now she's dead, now you can marry somebody else. And so I think what Jesus is talking about is Moses wrote this to kind of protect women. They were in a difficult situation in that day and age, and so maybe when you think about it from the standpoint of preventing a greater evil occurring, it would be to write this woman a divorcement paper, and then she could go out and become another man's wife because she's got those divorce papers. But I know without a shadow of a doubt, Jesus said from the beginning, that's not the way it was. And if you want to know what it's supposed to be like, go back to the beginning. So kind of interesting, but again, I wish we had more information about it and could study it a little bit deeper. Anybody else you think about it from a different perspective? Yes, sir.
This may not be what you were wanting, but it goes back to being selfish, I guess. But I have 8 siblings, older siblings that have all been divorced in our family out of this 11, and I've got a bad taste in my mouth for this whole subject. But what I think we really need to emphasize is the reasoning that God does this. There's just so much havoc that it creates by people doing this, just selfishness. And all the family problems that you have from then on, I mean, it doesn't stop. It just keeps going, and it just goes everywhere. I mean, you can just look at one family situation and just just like throwing a rock in the water, it just goes in all directions.
Yeah.
In our family, it's just really bad subject.
Yeah, and like you said, it's a ripple effect, isn't it? I mean, one of the I don't know if I should call it the worst thing, but one of the bad things that's often seen is divorce is the children.
It just tears people's lives up.
Yeah.
Every direction.
Yeah, and it's devastating, isn't it? And it's bad. It's bad for people. It's bad for the spouses involved. It's bad for their children. It's just not a good situation all the way around.
And generations way down the line.
Yeah, you're right. But it's like every other problem sin creates. I mean, look at our world today. If we lived by God's ideals and laws, it'd be great, wouldn't it? But sin always creates problems in our lives. Yes, sir.
Talking about the problems that divorce creates, something that I've always believed is that when you marry somebody, you don't just marry them, you marry their entire family. The good, the bad, all of it. Well, if you have a good marriage, at least in the beginning, and you build relationships with that family, when you divorce them, you're not just hurting, there's not just the pain between you and your spouse. You have an entire family that you're telling, I don't want to be a part of you anymore. And like you referred to the ripple effect, it reaches out a lot further than people think about.
Yeah.
Just like marriage goes a lot further than sometimes, unfortunately, people think about, because you do marry the whole family.
Yeah. I think what Jesus is telling them there in verse 8 is you don't understand the intentions behind what Moses wrote. It wasn't so you could just divorce your wife for any reason and be married 100 times in your life. But again, he said from the beginning that wasn't the case. And so I think what he's telling us is, they tried to do something to hinder easy divorce. And one of those involved, if you're going to divorce your wife, you can never remarry her. Okay, if you're going to put her away, doesn't matter. She goes and marries somebody else and you decide you want to get back together, no, against the law. Or she goes and marries somebody else, he dies, you want to get back together, can't do it. Once you divorce her, it's over with. You know, you're never going to have that relationship back. And so I think what Jesus is saying, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I think what he's saying is Moses wrote some things to try to slow divorce down and keep it in check and protect women in that day and age. And so one of them was that writing of divorcement, but it wasn't a license to just go out and divorce, you know, whoever you wanted to marry, whoever you wanted. But that's how a lot of the Jews took it. So I see another hand. Go ahead, brother.
Where's the scripture that says God hates divorce?
Yeah, Malachi 2:10 is what you're talking about. Yeah. It ranks up there with lying, shedding innocent blood. You know, those things that God hates. So it tells you a lot about it, doesn't it? Just that verse itself. Appreciate that. So Jesus had this discussion with these people, and what's interesting to me, question 5 here, is what do his own disciples? You know, they just listened to Jesus talk about marriage and divorce. And what do they think about his take on marriage and divorce?
Never got married.
Yeah, they said, listen, if this is the way it is, it's a poor policy to get married, right? You'd be better off not to even get married. But again, I think it's indicative of the low esteem that the world and the Jews even placed on women, and of course marriage itself. So Jesus kind of responded to that idea. He talked about those who never do get married. And what did he say about those who never get married? Question 6. Basically, he talked about 3 groups of people, right? What's the first group? That's right, people who are born from their mother's womb, right? Some people don't have the physical capabilities that are involved in marriage. Some people don't have the mental capacity to be married, do they? And so there's some people who are born from their mother's womb who, I don't want to say not marriage material because that sounds bad, but they just never, they're never going to have a use for that relationship in their life because of the way that they've been born. So yeah, he said there's some people who shouldn't get married. That's one of them. What about the second one he talks about?
Eunuchs of men.
Yeah, eunuchs who've been made so by men. You have to understand in that day and age, and you read about a lot of people who are taken into captivity, but any of the males who had any part in government, their ability to engage in an intimate relationship was taken away from them. And they did that for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons was so that the royal line didn't get infiltrated. But those are people who wouldn't have physical capabilities when it came to marriage, right? So no need for them to get married. What about the third group he talked about?
Would that have made Daniel a eunuch?
Yes, that was his situation. I think that's why you don't read about his wife in the scripture, because he never had one. What about the third group?
People that make them decide to be eunuchs on their own.
Yeah, and for what purpose does he mention specifically here?
Heaven's sake.
Yeah, so do you have to get married? I mean, is that a law of God? No. Marriage is not a relationship to enter into lightly, is it? A lot of forethought, a lot of planning, a lot of compatibility issues to take into account. Not everybody wants to get married, though. There's some people, and he talks about the group here. I think what he's talking about is a lot like what Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians 7. People who don't want, that's kind of a bad way, distractions, I was going to say. Any distractions in life. But family's not a distraction. It's a responsibility, isn't it? And so when you get married and you have a spouse, Is that gonna take up more of your time? Yeah. Okay, you decide you're gonna have children. Is that gonna take up more of your time? Yeah. So a person who doesn't get married doesn't have to worry about pleasing their spouse. They don't have to worry about, spending time with their children. And so they can fully devote themselves to God. Now that doesn't mean that God views their relationship, an unmarried person, as more devoted than a married person. In fact, if everybody chose the unmarried relationship, where would we be today? Not here, right? Not going to work without that. But it is a choice that people can make. And so Jesus didn't condemn people for that. If they want to make that choice, that's fine. But also, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, if you married, you haven't sinned. Okay, you haven't done anything to violate God's law. But there are some people who never get married. And that's basically the three groups that Jesus talks about there. So, well, we had two other sections here, but I wanted to cover that one pretty extensively because I think that's the only opportunity we got when we're going through these accounts of the gospel. So, does anybody have any thoughts or comments or anything to add there on marriage and divorce?
There was also fewer attorneys.
Well, maybe fewer rich attorneys. Yeah, that's probably good observation. Not nearly the business cards and advertisements today, huh? Some lawyers specialize in that area, don't they? Yeah, make good money, lots of money. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
You ever think if it was as hard to get married as it is to get divorced, maybe people who got married would stay that way? I know they always talk about, you mentioned the Bible specifically, but that divorce being difficult, make you think about it before you do it. That being said, if you couldn't just run down on justice of the peace and get it done, and it was a process
Yeah.
that you had to put work into to get that little piece of paper from the government that says you're married, and get someone to have you say your vows, I wonder how many people would get married.
Yeah. I think the laws of men can certainly encourage and influence divorce, don't you? Yeah. And of course, our nation's been on both sides of the coin. Sometimes in our history, it really made divorce hard, didn't it? Not today, though. We're on the other side of that today. So, yeah. All right. Appreciate your attention and your comments.